Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with a returned guest, Dr. Daniel Conroy-Beam. He is Associate Professor of Psychology in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And today we're going to talk about the manosphere and how people there misuse research in evolutionary psychology. And by the way, I'm also leaving a link in the description to my first interview with Dr. Conroy-Beam. So, Dr. Conroy-Beam, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm excited to talk.
So, first of all, and I mean, as a way of introducing the topic for people who might not be familiar with it, even though I think that at least people who spend some time on the internet and social media should at least come across the word manosphere, at least that. But what is the manosphere exactly?
Yeah, good question, and it's a hard question. I've been thinking about how to answer this. I'm not sure there is a good short answer. I mean, the best I could say, it's a nebulous, loose collection of different online communities, as well as the influencers and media that cater to them. Maybe there probably is no like one single uniting thing, but the closest you can get to a uniting thing is sort of concern with men's issues in society at large today. There's a heavy influence in a lot of corners in the manosphere, a heavy focus on issues of like dating and relationships. That's probably the biggest concern that unites a lot of manosphere communities and manosphere influencers, but also concerns about sort of like social justice, but with inequalities towards men. So this includes things like, men's rights advocates who are concerned about like sort of legal and social, perceived legal and social inequalities that men experience in modern society, all the way to like, pickup artists who are mainly concerned with like just, dating advice, how to like hack psychology to have more success in dating and relationships, maybe not even relationships, maybe just dating. And then, of course, like the extreme end on the other side are incels who are like primarily concerned with, their own personal lack of success in the dating realm. And as well as all the influencers that cater to these people. So like the big names are, probably people you've heard of, your like Andrew Tates, your Fresh and Fits, maybe as far as like your Jordan Petersons, maybe even bordering upon your like Joe Rogans even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's basically a large collection of people that includes, I mean, pickup artists, the red pill community, the black pill community, some of the incel community, and I mean, basically people like that, right?
Yeah. Those I would characterize as being, all big parts of the manosphere community.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the main reason why I invited you on the show to talk about the manosphere, because, I mean, I could have invited other people to talk about the same topic, is because at a certain point, and you're going to tell us about that, you found out that your own research was being misused by people from the manosphere. So tell us about that. How did you learn about it? And what kinds of, or what parts of your research were being misused by them? I mean, tell us all about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I want to be clear, and it's, I appreciate, there are other people you can invite. So I want to be clear, like, I'm not an expert on the manosphere, right? I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a historian, right? I don't want to claim that I have like special insight into like the workings or the history of the manosphere or these kinds of like social communities. What I'm an expert in human mating, right? The psychology of human mating. That's where my work is. That's what I focus on. That's what I, think about day to day. The manosphere, being in this sphere, of course, in the mating sphere, right? Like, of course, I was vaguely aware of the manosphere for a long time. It's, these things come up, right? So I sort of like knew it was out there. Students would talk to you, they discover like, oh, you study human mating, like, what do you think about this like pickup artist YouTuber that I watch or something like that? They would like ask you your opinions on these things. Or, Jeffrey Miller he wrote that book, was it called Date, I think, which was supposed to be like a sort of more scientifically informed pickup artistry book. I think that came out when I was in grad school. I'm a fan of like a YouTube video essay too. I'll often throw something up when I'm working. I'm a big fan of like FT Signifier, who talks about a lot of these things. I've seen some of like your interviews on these things. So it was like, I was like aware of it, but I always sort of kept it at an arm's length, because I was just like, this is just a unserious, uninteresting, kind of gross collection, if I'm being honest, of online communities. And, I'm interested in the science, so I just sort of ignored it. I wasn't like really forced to like confront it and see my connection to it until it was actually one of your prior guests. So Louis Bachot, who you've had on the podcast before. So this was maybe 2 years ago now or something like that. Louis actually came out to Santa Barbara to visit. So Louis is like a sociologist by training. And he was doing his PhD on connections between evolutionary psychology and the manosphere. So he came out to Santa Barbara. He spent I think a month with us, hanging around my lab meeting, hanging around the Center for Evolutionary Psychology. And he gave us a talk on his work on, ways in which evolutionary psychology gets used in the manosphere. And I remember like sitting in the Center for Evolutionary Psychology lab space, like listening to Louis' talk. And he's like, the incel community, they maintain this Wikipedia page, called the Scientific Black Pill. That's just a giant, basically annotated bibliography of, peer-reviewed research papers that they claim support their worldview. And like a lot of your guys' work is in here. And we just like pulled it up, and we're just like searching for, our names and people's names that we knew. And I remember the like feeling of like vertigo, like seeing, my papers and my friends' papers being cited in this like, annotated bibliography of like misogyny as like, supporting these ideologies that I didn't think my work supported. I still don't think my work supported. So that was really my like inroad into this. I owe a debt to Louis to opening my eyes to this, and have just been sort of grappling since then with like, how do you move forward, right? How do you make sense of like, why is our work getting used in this way, and what does that mean like for us as scientists?
Okay, but when it comes to your own research, what kinds of claims were people from the manosphere making based on it? And I mean, in what ways were those claims misrepresenting your research?
Yeah, so I mean, like, to give a specific example, so I wrote this op-ed about this, which is also part of how I've gotten roped into this conversation, or this whole broader conversation. But one specific example was so it was a paper of mine that was cited in this Scientific Black Pill, this like Wikipedia page of peer-reviewed articles that support sort of like incel worldviews. I'm forgetting a little bit the details of how it was cited. I mean, it was a paper on sex differences and mate preferences that I had published. And they had cited it as evidence that like women prefer dominant partners, women prefer dominant men as partners. And it was interesting because they had quoted like a colleague of mine who was a co-author on that paper, as I recall, as describing the paper as having found that women prefer dominant men as partners. And this was supposed to, support the idea that like, women are always looking to trade up from, the low status loser to some like high status loser. So you can't trust women to be faithful to you long term because they're always going to dump you for some higher status dominant alpha, right? This is the interpretation that they drew out of my paper. But I mean, the crazy thing was, I looked at that and I was like, I don't remember us having a measure of preference for dominance in that paper, right? Like, I'm pretty sure I don't generally ask that. It was an older paper for me at that time. So I was like, maybe I just forgot what measures we had in that paper. But yeah, I went back to the paper. We did not ask about preferences for dominance in that paper, right? That paper had no evidence of any sex difference in preference for dominance. I mean, I believe such a difference has been found before, but that was not in our paper. And even, people have like defended that quote, that citation, because it was actually a colleague who quoted the paper saying that, and the incel wiki was just or the scientific black pill was just quoting the colleague. But even if you go to the colleague's quotation, right, if you go to the paper that they're quoting from, my colleague is saying, they aren't saying that this paper, they aren't saying that women have a preference for dominance, right? Like the section that they quoted was from the discussion section of that paper, where they were considering alternative explanations to what they were actually talking about in that paper. So they were saying, you might argue, for example, that women have a preference for dominance, but the very next sentence was them arguing against that idea, right? So even the quotation that they chose, like that quote was referring to evidence that didn't exist. But even that quote, like the researchers were not arguing for what they cherry picked out of that sentence. They were actually arguing the opposite. And that was just like a sort of devil's advocate kind of like, even if you thought this were true, here's some alternative evidence. So it's just like it was a crazy, weird like game of telephone where like my paper morphed into like this claim that was never found in the paper, like that morphed into this like counterpoint that was like cherry picked selectively out of this discussion section. So, if you didn't know these things, if you didn't know the literature, if you're just like a curious, frustrated young guy, this is going to look to you like, oh, this is a great resource. Here's all of these like scientific papers with direct quotations that like back up this worldview that seems really coherent and really interesting. But you just like scratch the surface a little bit and you see like, at least in my case, right, like there's no connection between what the black pill said about the work and what the work was actually saying.
Yeah. By the way, what was the paper about exactly?
The original paper?
Yes.
I don't even recall which one was it. I think this was a paper on using like multivariate approaches to look at sex differences and mate preferences. So, there was some argument that essentially, sex differences and mate preferences have been of interest for a long time because there are, relevant theoretical questions there. And most people, when they look at mate preferences, people have a lot of preferences. This is something that I think the incels also overlook, right? If you ask people what they're looking for in a partner, they say a lot of things, right? They say they want somebody who's kind and intelligent and attractive and, funny and, shares my, religious worldview and et cetera, et cetera. They generally won't stop talking until you stop them from talking. But when we consider, sex differences and mate preferences, we often just pick one of those at a time, look at the difference on that dimension, write it down, move on to the next one, move on to the next one. This was like sort of the start of what became like a cornerstone of my research area, which is like mate choice is highly multivariate, right? Like we're looking for lots of things. We're trying to satisfy lots of preferences at the same time. And so we shouldn't look at life one dimension at a time. We should consider all of these things collectively and, how big are the differences across all of these dimensions. So that was part of why it was like, again, so jarring to see them sort of like laser focus on my paper, laser focus on like sex differences and dominance, because very few of my papers are ever about like we should emphasize this one difference a lot, right? Most of my papers are like, what is the bigger picture, right? How do we not lose the forest for the trees? So I did not remember emphasizing a sex difference in dominance per se, and it's because I didn't.
And do you know if this kind of phenomenon of people in the manosphere misusing research in evolutionary psychology is a more generalized thing? I mean, is that something that they do frequently or not?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I would encourage all of my colleagues in evolutionary psychology to like peruse the scientific black pill. It's uncomfortable but eye-opening experience to see, how our work gets interpreted sort of one step out. I think there's a lot of ideas that start in evolutionary psychology and make it into these manosphere circles, but they just, something's getting lost in translation, right? They're getting distorted in ways that, in some cases, some people might agree with, I don't know. but I think in many cases, probably not. I know I'm a little hazy on the details now, but I remember there was another, like in that same talk where Louis was like showing this to us. He had a specific example of my colleague Patrick Durkee. They had cited some work of Patrick's as making some claim about like dating and mating advice or something like that. But the crazy thing is Patrick doesn't study mating, right? Patrick studies status and personality, right? It was again like the claim that they were making on Patrick's work, I know, is not something that Patrick studies, is not something that Patrick is interested in. It was just like they do this kind of like really superficial sort of like keyword search, and like any sort of like word that you can interpret as being connected to what the argument they want to make, like they just grab that, they cherry pick the citation, they cherry pick the quotation if it's useful, and it ends up looking like this exhaustive resource base, but it's all pretty selective, it's all pretty embellished. It doesn't connect with the real back and forth that's happening in these actual literatures. It's I think like incels, Louis, had, I was actually just reading his dissertation recently, and he had this like meme, this like Manosphere meme that he quoted in it that was like, on the one hand, scientists are like, here's the evidence, what conclusions can we draw from this? And on the other hand, it was like feminists, and what feminists do is like, here's the conclusion, what facts can we find to support it? And it's ironic because like that's exactly what they're doing, right? Like they have a worldview that they believe in and they want to support, and they're just trolling through the literature to find anything that could be loosely interpreted as supporting that worldview and ignoring everything else, and just like extracting a long list of things that they can use as like easy talking points to like gish gallop people in debates over their worldview. To give another like concrete example, one scientific idea that looms really large in manosphere circles is the dual mating strategy hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Right. So this is a hypothesis that genuinely was very popular in evolutionary psychology. This genuinely was like the scientific state of the art in like 2010, right? Like, and this is, the idea that, there are shifts in women's mating psychology over the course of the menstrual cycle, specifically, around ovulation near the fertile window, right? The exact details of this have changed over time as the science has progressed, but, at least part of the original idea was like, there's this increased interest in, short-term mating, especially with like attractive dominant men, as a means of pursuing this dual mating strategy where you get sort of like, you sort of conceive offspring with partners who have, good genes or indicators of good genes, but then you potentially pursue investment for those offspring from men who don't necessarily have those markers, from men who are, better long-term partners, more cooperative, good provider kind of partners. This was a really popular idea in 2010. And it still, has its supporters, although the idea has like progressed and matured a lot over that time, right? The versions of the dual mating strategy hypothesis that exist in the scientific literature today do not look very much like the versions that get discussed in the manosphere today, right? So the manosphere has taken this as like, women are sort of like untrustworthy, all they want to do is just like have sex with chads, and then, dupe losers into supporting the children that they produce with these like genetically superior alpha males, right? And science supports that. But like, the versions of the dual mating strategy hypothesis that exist today are much more subtle, much more sophisticated, have much more like, conditional caveats, and even like within the field too, like I think the popularity of the dual mating strategy hypothesis has waned a lot, right? There are prominent competitors, prominent alternative explanations that now I would say on average are more popular, right? So my colleague, Jim Roney, has been arguing from day one that the dual mating strategy hypothesis is wrong, that women don't have this dual mating strategy, that what shifts we do see across the menstrual cycle are mostly byproducts of adaptations that are designed to calibrate behavior across different menstrual cycles. So like there's really, really prominent disagreement about this hypothesis within the scientific literature that is absent from manosphere discussions of the science, right? They do not know. I mean, good for my colleague Jim. They don't know who he is. They don't know his ideas. He lives a happier life than I do. But like they're not discussing, the scientific debate that's emerging because they don't care about the debate. They don't care about the evidence. They just want to cherry pick the stuff that supports their worldview. And they're also not discussing, the advances even on the dual mating strategy side. They're not discussing the advances and the subtleties that like that side has offered. They're just like frozen in this like, superficial interpretation of this like 2010 version of this hypothesis because, that's what supports their worldview. That's all they need.
So you've already given us a specific example there, but are there other examples among the claims you came across over time that you think are, that you would think are the most worrying coming from the manosphere that would link at least with some evolutionary psychology research? I mean, claims that maybe are the most harmful, like, for example, misogynistic claims or claims that inspire hate toward women, for example, which are very common. I mean, do you have any other examples like that?
I mean, yeah, that's a pretty bad one, right? I think this interpretation of this dual mating strategy hypothesis is pretty popular, and I think it does ground. I said there's not a lot of things that unite the manosphere, but I do think anti-feminist attitudes, if we want to say misogynist attitudes, I think that's like another uniting feature in a lot of manosphere claims. And I do think this interpretation of the dual mating strategy hypothesis does in particular like lend itself a lot to these sorts of misogynistic attitudes, right? And there's this like odd tendency, again, I would also recommend to all my colleagues, go read the Red Pill subreddit. Just check it periodically. Again, it's not going to feel good, but it's going to be eye-opening in terms of, how our ideas and our ways of thinking get appropriated in these spheres. And there's just like this weird tendency where, like, when it comes to thinking about women's mating psychology, these people are really dedicated amateur scientists, right? Like they're really willing to put women's mating psychology under a microscope and, analyze it in these like pseudo evolutionary terms. And that's where like, the dual mating strategy hypothesis is useful, right? You can characterize women as being just sort of like Darwinian automatons who are just, controlled like puppets by their genes towards like dating, having sex with these alpha male chads and, duping these like, poor betas into supporting their lifestyles, right? It's a very anti-woman, and it, very much deprives, how do I say this? You could get the impression, they are interested in the evolutionary psychology of men's mating psychology as well. They do acknowledge that, men's mating psychology is evolved too. But if you read these, it would be very easy to come away, if you read the way they actually talk about these things, it would be very easy to come away with the belief that like only men have free will. Like men are out here just trying to do the right thing, just trying to live a good life. But they are sort of victims to women's mating psychology in large part because of this dual mating strategy logic, right? So I think that does support, I don't know if it creates, but it does support this particularly misogynistic, I think, anti-feminist worldview. I think there are other things, like I said, my specialty is in preferences. And when you read, another major part of especially like incel worldviews, as I understand it, is this like obsession. There's a belief that women really value physical attractiveness, again, stemming from this dual mating strategy hypothesis, like the idea that what women are looking for are these like good genes indicators, this like masculinity, dominance, height, muscularity, et cetera, et cetera. That's like what women really care about. And they don't care about, people who are kind and good-hearted and, nice guys finish last, sort of woe is me kind of attitude. So they have this belief that like physical attractiveness really is what matters in human relationships, and they really ignore all of the substantial evidence that like physical attractiveness is not the most important thing to most people,
Yeah.
which is one of the most robust findings from preference research. This is where evolutionary psychologists can catch some flack, right? I think a lot of the evolutionary psychology of mate preferences, for reasons, but nonetheless, has really heavily emphasized sex differences in mate preferences. And when you look at, if you order mate preferences in terms of like how sex differentiated they are, yeah, things like age, physical attractiveness, resources, those are some of the larger sex differences in mate preferences. Those are the things that men and women disagree on the most in terms of what they're looking for in a partner. But if you order preferences in terms of what do people actually find important, what do people actually value in a partner, like physical attractiveness is pretty middling for most people around the world, and it has been for as long as people have been doing this research, right? Physical attractiveness is not the most important thing to men or women, to most men or women. The things that are most important to people are things like kindness, right? That is generally the thing that appears towards the top of most people's lists. And that, I think, gets zero play in these manosphere circles. Or, they sort of accuse women of being deceitful about how much they value kindness. But of course, men are not being deceitful. That couldn't be. So yeah, I think that's another way where the literature gets distorted in ways that support these, I think misogynistic, anti-feminist worldviews. There's other things. There's one idea, I think maybe Louis introduced this to me. I don't remember where I learned about this, but there's something that like a reasonably popular idea among incels called Briffault's law or something like that, which is like, it's supposed to be an idea from evolutionary biology that like basically like the female of the species like dictates all like patterns of interactions. So like, if there's no benefit to an interaction from females, then like females have power to like end that interaction. And this is supposed to be, again, this contributes to this sort of like anti-feminist worldview that like, women secretly control society, and that like feminism is a covert agenda to advance women's interests in society over men. And, they cite this Briffault's law as like, evidence that this is grounded in like evolutionary biological principles. But like, I had never heard of Briffault's law before I started reading this Manosphere stuff. It turns out like I tried to include this like in an early draft of my Boston Globe thing, but it got cut. But like, it turns out like Briffault was like a surgeon. Like he wasn't even a scientist. He was just like a French surgeon who just said this. I don't think it was based on any evidence really. It was just this guy's opinion. And I don't think it really caught on at the time. Somehow it got rediscovered. And, the Manosphere has decided that this is like a scientifically supported law, but like no scientist I've ever heard of, I've never heard a scientist talk about this. I've never heard a scientist reference this. Psychology is not generally the kind of science that issues laws. Like we don't understand the mind enough to be making laws. Maybe if you're like a psychophysicist, maybe if you're talking about like how bright a point of light is on a wall, like maybe you can start dictating, you can start expressing some laws, but like, it's very unusual to hear like a psychological scientist or an anthropologist talk about laws other than maybe like scaling laws in like how big an organism's arm is relative to its body or something like that. So it's just like a complete fabrication that has like the veneer of science on it. But like, again, you scratch the surface a little bit and you see like there's no actual scientific basis for this idea.
Yeah. But I mean, from your own perspective as an evolutionary psychologist, why do you think that evolutionary psychology became so popular among people from the manosphere? What makes it so appealing to them?
Oh, it's a good question. And it's something I've been asking myself for 2 years now. And I'm afraid I don't have a great answer. I think there's multiple things that could be contributing here. It's probably not just one thing. I mean, for one, to our credit, I guess, we as evolutionary psychologists, we have a lot to say about human mating and human relationships. And that is a big part of what the Manosphere cares about, right? These are people who are frustrated with their experiences in love. they're turning to the modern science of dating and relationships and love. And, evolutionary psychologists have done a good job mapping human mating psychology and providing insights into human relationships. And so I think it's pretty natural you would come across evolutionary psychology if you're looking for, a greater understanding of why things aren't going the way you want them in your personal life. That said, like, we're not the only game in town, right? Social psychologists have also made a lot of really valuable contributions. So sociologists, so anthropologists. So there is something out of all of the people who have something to say, they are picking out us in particular. And so I think we as evolutionary psychologists, I think we do have to think hard about, what are we doing that's making our science stand out as interesting to these people with these particularly hateful worldviews. I think there is a long history of, right-wing movements appropriating evolutionary theory. I think it's not hard. There's a dim read of like selfish gene, genic level selection that I think, caters to particular sort of like right-wing authoritarian worldviews, right? Like survival of the fittest kind of, especially if you're prone to committing the naturalistic fallacy and believing that, what is natural is good or should be. I think the idea that like selection works by, sort of culling out the weak and leaving only the strong for the survival of the species or whatever, I think can be appealing to people who have certain kind of right-wing ideologies, which I think does tie into sort of anti-feminist ideologies and misogynistic ideologies. There's also, of course, a long history of association between evolutionary thinking and eugenics, of course. And I think a lot of these, I don't think eugenics per se is a part of the manosphere ideology, but I would not, I think there is a general, these days, a trend in especially a lot of online communities, a lot of online right-wing communities. Eugenics is having a resurgence, and I would not be surprised if there's some overlap between, the kinds of people who these manosphere ideologies appeal to, as well as the kinds of people who, these neo-eugenics ideas appeal to. So I think it's not hard. It's unfortunately not hard to kind of fall into these right-wing ideologies from evolutionary thinking, especially if you have a kind of superficial read of what evolutionary theory is or says. So I think that's just like a constant struggle that you have to fight with when you are a scientist in these evolutionary spaces, right? Like not catering to these like again superficial reads of what evolutionary theory is that promotes these right-wing ideologies. And then I also think partly because of this, there's a long history of evolutionary approaches to behavior, especially human behavior, being controversial, right? I think because of these, long-standing right-wing associations, there is an understandable, from people with especially left-wing ideologies, there's an understandable hesitance around evolutionary approaches to behaviors. There can be a sort of knee-jerk rejection of these kinds of approaches, knee-jerk criticism of these approaches. So it gets automatically, no matter what you're doing or saying, I think taking an evolutionary approach to human behavior automatically is controversial. And it's automatically controversial to people with more, left-leaning ideologies. And so I think for that reason, the field takes on a reputation as being like kind of a safe space for provocateurs, right? This is the place where you go if you want to say controversial things, especially if you want to say things that run contrary to left-wing ideologies, right? So I think there are a lot of people who come to the field not because they have a deep interest in like, Santa Barbara style adaptationism, but just because like they enjoy making people mad, and they especially enjoy making, left-leaning people mad. And I think there are some scientists who have that kind of motivation, right? I think they come to the field just because they want to say controversial things. And I think there are a lot of lay people who, the field has gained that reputation. And so they come to the field like, if I know I don't like feminism, if I know I've got these misogynistic ideas, I know I want some scientific backing for these kind of anti-left-wing ideas, then, hey, there's this evolutionary psychology thing that people on the left seem to hate. and has these like provocative people who are running their mouths, right? Like this seems like maybe a good place to find the kind of scientific support that I'm looking for. And I really worry that the field is maybe kind of trapped in this sort of positive feedback loop where I think by virtue of having this reputation as being a safe place to stir a controversy, right, it attracts people who are more interested in controversy than science. Those people do and say controversial things, which earns the field that more of that reputation, which attracts more of these people, and I think makes it more and more an appealing place to these manosphere communities. So even though I don't think these things have a deep connection to the theoretical logic of the field, it's like sort of hard to shake out of this reputation and hard to get away from these cycles of controversy.
And what do you make of evolutionary psychologists who are public intellectuals and align themselves with the manosphere, or at the very least sympathize with the manosphere?
We're being recorded, right? I think there are lots of people out there with lots of different motivations, some of which I think are purer than others. It's not an easy thing to know what to do about, right? I think there's certainly a part of me, especially there was once a part of me that was like, yeah, I just want to close my eyes to all of this stuff and just do my science, right? The best thing we can do is just put as much truth out there into the world, and eventually that truth will filter out. Like someone else will, I'm a scientist, I'm not a public intellectual, I'm not a good popularizer. Like it's not my job, and it can't be my job to like communicate what I do to the masses. I'm just going to do my science, and like I'll trust that somebody else will communicate this accurately to the masses. That's a comforting idea. But like that's clearly doesn't work, right? I think we as scientists do have an obligation to, communicate our findings to the public, right? The public is bankrolling this work. We're doing it ostensibly for the public good. We have an obligation, I think, to make sure that our work is actually promoting the public good, and is, the public is actually educated on what science is finding. So I think there are people out there who are doing a noble job trying to accurately communicate, modern understanding of society and dating from science. I would count you among them. And I think that's something that like we as scientists need to do more and need to do better. I do think there are, so those public intellectuals I admire, and, incels, like, I don't want to say like incels are necessarily bad people, right? I think incel ideologies are bad. I think they're despicable. I think they have led to tangible harm. I think both to women and to men. Like I think the men who fall into this are being harmed by these like fatalistic, false ideologies. But I don't think like the men who fall into this are necessarily bad people, right? I can understand. I've like had friends who have fallen into these circles, right? Like I think there's a not terribly distant universe where I could have fallen into these sorts of ideologies, right? Like I get it. And so I think, it is good to try to engage with these men, right? I think it's a noble effort to try to show these people that you don't have to believe these things. I think there is a read of the science that is more hopeful, is not anti-feminist. And I think there are people out there trying to do that. And I think that's a good thing. And I admire those public intellectuals. But it's also engaging with these kinds of communities, it can be difficult because, by engaging, the academic freedom types will say, everything should kind of live or die in the marketplace of ideas, right? Like you should not be afraid to debate anything. And, if your idea is really good, it will survive. And there's some truth in that, but at the same time, like engaging some of these ideologies can run the risk of legitimizing them in ways that really backfire. right? Some of these ideas are just bad. They're just stupid and they should just be ignored. And, if you try to debate these people, there are people out there who are not earnestly interested in debate, right? They are ideologues. You're not going to change their mind. You're not going to change their community's minds. And by debating them, you're just making them, especially if you're coming with university credentials, and if you're using your valuable time as a scientist to debate with these people, you're sending a signal to the world that this is an ideology that's worth paying attention to. So even if you feel as though you've definitively bested them in the marketplace of ideas, there's a lot of ideologues out there who are not going to care what you have to say, and they're just going to say look, we got this scientist to pay attention to us. That means we've got something worth saying. So I think engaging with these communities can be good, but you need to do it really carefully in a way that's not legitimizing them, in a way that's not giving them clout that they don't deserve. I think there are some people who even sort of flirt with, I think in an effort to maybe ingratiate themselves a little bit with these communities to get better access. I think there's people who maybe inadvertently end up sort of promoting some of these ideologies. And then I think there are people who are just cynical and they're public intellectuals just because they want to be famous, and this just happened to be their best way to do that. I think they don't have the public's interest in mind. I think this is just a good way to get a paycheck for them, and so they are gleefully. I don't think they care about these issues. I don't think they care whether Manosphere ideologies are right or not. I think they're bullshitters. I think they don't care what the truth is. They just care what butters their bread. And those people I think are despicable. I won't name names, but you can probably guess who I think they are from just their attitudes and my social media. But those people I think they're willing to sell out the field. I think they're willing to sell out the science to make a quick buck for themselves. And I think that's what's sort of perpetuating this positive feedback cycle that is really damaging. I think evolutionary psychology is one of the best scientific enterprises in the history of psychology. I think this is the best way to do psychology. I think this is our best hope to understand the human mind and harness this to improve society. But I think I worry about our ability to achieve that because there are these, I think, bad actors who are willing to cash in on whatever scientific credibility the rest of us are working hard to build in order to get, an extra high-paying speaking gig or, a nice, editorial position on some white supremacist magazine or something like that. So yeah, those people I think are bad. Did I answer your question? I don't remember.
Yes, I think so. So let me ask you now. I'm not sure to what extent this will be a little bit speculative, but from what you understand, what do you think are the motivations of people who made a name for themselves in the manosphere? Is it money, social status? Maybe I'm not sure. I don't know their own personal stories, but I would imagine that perhaps at least one or two of them would have a history of bad past relationships or something like that. So, but what do you think about it?
I don't think there's one easy answer, and I think I kind of said part of what I think about this, right? I think the manosphere itself is nebulous. It's a loose collection of a lot of different people and communities. So I don't think there's one motivation you can ascribe to all people who are in these circles. Look, it's easy and fun to be cynical and just say all of these people are grifters. They're just in it to get a paycheck for themselves. They don't care about, they don't care about these people. They don't care about the ground truth of these ideologies. They're just after money and status for themselves. And that's actually, I think, a good heuristic when it comes to influencers of all stripes, right? that's probably going to lead you right more often than it leads you wrong. So if you want a pat answer, yeah, like you can trust that most people are doing the things that they're doing, just because it gives them money and status. But I don't think that's true of everybody. Yeah, I think there's probably a spectrum here. I think there are people who do have some more, misguided as they may be, have some more genuine motivations, and then I think there are people who are just like cynical cash grab people. So I think like Andrew Tate, Fresh and Fit, like I don't think they care about their audiences, right? I don't think they want to help anybody, right? They're con artists, right? If you're watching this, you're somebody who's like, maybe adjacent to the Zenzel circle, maybe you're curious about these things. Like I promise you, Andrew Tate doesn't give a shit about you. Like he's a con artist. He's in it to make as much money for himself. He's a convicted criminal, right? I don't think he has a deep commitment to any particular worldview. I don't think he has a deep interest to like helping men live better lives or whatever. I think he just wants to make as much money and have as much status as he can get. Other people like, I don't know, your Jordan Petersons. Does Jordan Peterson think he's helping people? I think he's wrong. I think he's misguided. I think he is doing a lot of harm. But like, is he? I could believe that he is so deluded that he doesn't think he's doing that. Like, I could believe that he thinks he's doing the right thing and he's just wrong about what the right thing is. But I also think he likes money and status too, right? I think he's, he could have stayed in his university position and he could have done these things, by doing the science, but he chose to become this, firebrand, controversial public intellectual influencer type. So, I think that he does have some self-interest as well. I think, these like dating coach, pickup artist kind of YouTubers and TikTok guys and book writers, I think those guys maybe have the most pure intentions. Again, I think their ideas are misogynistic and wrong. But I think, for the most part, I think they do think that they're like helping men with their dating problems, right? And, making some money, but we all got to make money. So I think there's a diversity of motivations out there, some of which are pure and some of which are not. And it can be hard to tell, in some cases, exactly how pure there are. But in some cases, again, your Andrew Tates et al., it's pretty clear that they have no intentions of helping anyone in their lives.
Right. I mean, it seems to me, I don't know if you will agree with this or not, but it seems to me at the end of the day that what the manosphere mostly offers men are rationalizations for their failures. Do you agree with that, or at least to some extent?
It's tough. I don't know that I want to say, like, I guess it depends on what you mean by rationalizations. It's so easy and so tempting to be cynical. It's so easy to just say like these people are losers and they're just looking for excuses for why they're losers. But I don't think that's what we should say, and I don't think that's quite right. I think there are people out there, who are like that. But I think, again, not being a sociologist, not being like an expert in manosphere or like incel psychology, in my opinion as like a mating psychology person who's just been sort of exposed to these things, my impression is like these are men who have some genuine frustrations, right? Some understandable frustrations, right? Like, mating is a big part of life, right? It's a thing that it makes sense to have lots of strong feelings about. And if it's not going the way that you want it to go, like that does feel terrible, right? Yeah. It feels terrible for good reasons. And so I think if you're the kind of guy who just for whatever reason, you're not having the success you want in relationships, I think it's reasonable to turn to Google and say like, what's going on, right? Why am I not having the life I want to have? How do I explain the situation that I'm in? And, what can I do to try to get out of it? And I think a lot of manosphere communities sort of emerged originally as like attempts to offer those kinds of answers. And they sort of fell into this kind of misogynistic, anti-feminist hateful, at times violent track at some point. But in principle, I think like the kinds, especially if you're not talking about these like grifter influencers who I think are appropriating these communities to their own interests. If you're just talking about like the men who are reading these things, who are posting these things, who are just trying to like get some advice, like I think they are just like, yeah, they're just like any person who's like, why is my sourdough not turning out the way I want it to, right? Like they're just going to internet communities, they're going to communities of people like them and trying to get advice, and it's just like has fallen into this strange strange misogynistic tone. So I don't know if it's like, I don't want to say it's rationalizations for their failures. I think it's just people trying to understand how to live a better life. And I'm sympathetic to them for that reason. But I do think it gets co-opted by people who don't necessarily have these people's best interests in mind.
Okay, so when it comes to those people who do not have these other people's best interests in mind and the kinds of erroneous and very negative claims that they make about women and other kinds of things, do you think, in what ways do you think that those claims might also hurt the men who are attracted to the manosphere?
Yeah, I think it's bad for these men, right? I think, and there's research out there, right? Like on, especially incels, right? I think are very hopeless, fatalistic people. I think by virtue of being convinced of this worldview that basically like if you are physically unattractive, you are sort of like doomed by Darwin to live this unhappy life. Where like, I mean, I think the incel worldview is basically either like you're a Chad and you're doomed to live this like playboy lifestyle where sure you'll get lots of sex but you'll never experience true love, or you're like a beta and like your fate is to be like duped by women forever. Like maybe you'll get like brief glimpses of what feels like love, but you'll ultimately be betrayed by like feminism and women's mating psychology. Like it's a really grim outlook. And I think it does contribute to a lot of depression and anxiety. Maybe, I don't know if it contributes, maybe it caters to the depression and anxiety that was already there, but like it's certainly not helping these men, feel good about their lives, right? I think it is providing, it's providing a worldview that just sort of keeps them stably hopeless. And I think that's why this does, as we see, like often result in self-harm or violence towards others, right? I think so it is a very negative I think these are very negative communities for the men in them. And again, I think these worldviews are false, right? I think these are based on misinterpretations of the science. I think they're based on misinterpretations of society. And so if we could convey to them what the science actually says and show them the world is not as hopeless as these, like manosphere communities are persuading them that it is, I do think they would be better off.
Mm-hmm. And I also think, I mean, just to talk about a specific example, I think that sometimes they might even hurt the chances of some of these men who are attracted to the manosphere, because if you go on, I don't know, or if you listen to the Fresh and Fit podcast or something along those lines, and you constantly hear from them things like you have to go to the gym, you have to have this chiseled body and face, you have to wear expensive clothes, you have to have an expensive car, you have to have a six-figure salary, a good house, and all of those kinds of things. I mean, that's not really true, that you have to have all of those things to be successful in the mating market. And perhaps some of the men who listen to this just quit because they can't have access to all of those things, I guess.
It's true. And I don't get it. I don't get, this is maybe my failure. Maybe this is why like I didn't become an incel or something, but like I just like you look at these guys who are telling you like this is the like secret to like happiness and relationship success. Like these people aren't happy. They're not having relationship success. And like, look, like again, if like you're like a incel curious person watching this, like, not to toot my own horn, but like I'm an expert in human mating psychology. Like, I do good work, I think, in these areas. I have like, I have some ideas about how human mating relationships work that other people, seem to think are onto something. And also, like, I'm like a ugly, chubby dork who like does not make a ton of money. I'm an academic, like, and I'm happily married. I'm happy, right? My wife and I had been together for 14 years or something like that, right? Like these people who are selling you this worldview, like they don't have what they're selling you, right? I do, right? I'm the established expert on human mating psychology, and I'm living a good life. I have a relationship. Like you don't need to like go to the gym if you want to go to the gym. Like work out if that makes you happy. It's good to be healthy. You should take care of your body, but like you don't need to be this like weird vision of this alpha male Chad. That's not even what women are actually looking for. And the data supports that, right? Like these people are lying to you. Like you don't need to believe these things.
Right. So what do you think should be done by evolutionary psychologists themselves to fight back against the misuse of their own research?
I don't know. I don't know. I think step one is at least acknowledging it, right? I think, like I said, for a long time, I was sort of vaguely aware the stuff was out there, but I was very happy to keep it at arm's length. And I think that was the wrong idea, right? Because I think as long as we ignore it, it just kind of, it festers on its own, right? Like these communities are going to keep taking our science, they're going to keep cherry picking and misquoting and misinterpreting it. And it's going to take on a weird life of its own, which is going to, contribute to this harm. And I think it's also going to reflect back on the reputation of the field. So I don't think we can ignore it. I don't think, again, I think we have to be careful though with how we engage these communities. I think there are people out there who, with sometimes good intentions, but I think have tried to like approach these communities from a scientific background, but do it in a way that I think ends up legitimizing these ideologies or legitimizing these worldviews. Again, you have to be careful with how you broach those conversations and broach those debates. So I don't think like evolutionary psychologists should be going out there and like having debates with like Manosphere influencers or going on Manosphere podcasts and like trying to show them the way, because I think that gives these people clout that they don't deserve. So I don't have the right answer here. I'm not confident that I've done the right thing. My gut reaction was, I do think one good thing we can do is just be vocal that like we do not agree with these ideologies, right? Like despite what you might read on the red pill subreddit or what you might read in the scientific black pill community, like we as scientists I think have a minimum obligation of just publicly and loudly saying, right, like we are the ones doing this science and we do not think this science necessarily leads to these ideologies. Some scientists may disagree, they're wrong, but that's fine. People are allowed to be wrong. But like, I think it's important for those of us who are level-headed and reasonable and right about these things to at least like publicly say it, like come out and say like, I don't think that these scientific findings necessarily lead to this worldview, because that at least makes it that much a little bit harder for these manosphere communities to appropriate these ideologies, right? If we scientists aren't at least showing that there's disagreement among the scientists, if we aren't showing that like you can be an evolutionary psychologist and not be anti-feminist and not be misogynist, then I think that silence, speaks volumes to, I'm thinking about like, a 15-year-old kid who's like, just starting out his like dating career and it's not going the way that he wants it to, and he's frustrated and he's depressed and he's looking for an explanation for what's happening to him and how to do better. And, if you go into these incel communities and you see these like pseudo-scientific, justifications for this worldview, and then you go to the scientists and the scientists are saying nothing. The scientists, aren't at least disagreeing with these things. They aren't at a minimum saying, I don't think that's how you interpret these things. But then that is sort of like tacit approval of these ideologies, right? So I think we as scientists at a minimum have an obligation to come out and say clearly in public, which I tried to do, that like you don't have to draw these interpretations out of this worldview. I think I've been accused of saying that like I don't know, that like scientists should like self-censor for this reason or something like that. Like, that I think we should like not study certain topics or something like that. I think that's stupid. Like, look at my CV. Like, I certainly don't think we should avoid studying these topics. I think these topics are really important, but I think we just need to be clear as we're studying these things. And again, like I don't think we should necessarily be making policy recommendations either. I'm not qualified to dictate public policy. I'm not qualified, to write like divorce laws, or I'm not qualified to give dating advice even. Like I'm not that kind of person. So I don't think evolutionary psychologists need to be going out there and saying, this is the ideology that I think my work supports. But I do think, especially when people are perverting our work to support harmful ideologies, I think we do have an obligation to come out publicly and say, no, that is not, at least a necessary interpretation of what my science says.
Mm-hmm. So as a last question, let me just put this through you to see what are your ideas about it. So in a Psychology Today post titled Combating the Misuse of Evolutionary Psychology Research, Andrew Thomas, who I've already had on the show, is also an evolutionary psychologist. He suggests 3 ways by which researchers can address misinterpretations. And the first one is avoid absolutes. The second one is emphasize similarities, not just differences. And the last one is highlight agency. So what do you think of that?
I think those are good first steps. I think that's just good science, right? I think as scientists, we shouldn't be issuing absolutes anyway, right? Science doesn't, it isn't math, right? We can't prove things. We work in trends and expectations and generalities. And so avoiding absolutes is just, how you should do your science to begin with, regardless of, manosphere communities or whatever. And I do think, again, this is a common place where you see the research getting lost in translation as it makes it out to these manosphere communities. Like I do think, especially if you're not especially statistically savvy, especially if you're not like immersed in these kind of data, day in, day out, and have a good intuition for what these data mean, a lot of the effect sizes in like the statistical effect sizes in human mating literature are really small. And that gets lost in translation as it makes it out onto like the scientific black pill wiki, right? Like you would think by reading these sort of like narrative description of what evolutionary psychologists are finding, you would think that these are like large absolute differences. But then when you actually look at the data, like a lot of the differences we're talking about are pretty small because human behavior is complicated. It's always caused by multiple factors. When multiple factors cause something, each one necessarily has a smaller impact. And so I think being clear, it's hard to make this clear. It's hard to like grok intuitively what like a Cohen's d of 0.2 means, but like I promise you, it's pretty small. Like that's the kind of difference that you can notice, in a carefully controlled scientific study, but you're probably not going to notice very much as you're walking down the street, right, with your human eye. So I think, psychologists in general could do a better job of being clear about how big are the effects we're actually studying. What do these actually mean for people's day-to-day lives? So I think that's a good thing to be mindful of. And I do think evolutionary psychologists, again, for good reasons, sex differences are important, and they do provide like good theoretical leverage in terms of like testing ideas about the nature of the mind. But evolutionary psychologists, I do think, have way overemphasized sex differences. I say this as a person who's done a lot of sex differences research, who has some sex difference research ongoing. Like, I think these things matter, but I do think we've studied sex differences to the exclusion of actually studying psychology to some degree. And I do think the field could use a bit of a course correction on that. Again, I think that's true independent of the manosphere, right? I think there's just a lot of things. There's a lot of things where, yeah, I think we've studied differences in the psychology, but we forgot to study how the psychology actually works in the first place. And so I do think that's a good idea. Agency, I think it's a weird one. That's maybe a more philosophical thing. I don't understand how one can be a professional psychologist and believe in free will. But I think where agency comes in, where agency gets lost in translation again, is I think the sort of manosphere take on things is generally like men have agency and women do not, right? And so I think like if you're going to focus on agency, you either need to be clear on everybody's agency, or you need to be clear on no one's agency, right? At the end of the day, like, yeah, I'm a psychologist. I think behavior is caused, and I think we can scientifically understand those causes. I don't think that provides, excuse from moral culpability for your behavior. But I think, you certainly don't want to be projecting an image that like women are sort of like slaves to their genetic interests, but men are sort of endowed with mystical free will that allows them to make good decisions or something like that. So I think those are all good scientific recommendations. I don't think that goes far enough, though, right? I think we as evolutionary psychologists do need to look inward, and we do need to be more careful with our language. We do need to be more careful, I think, with the kinds of topics that we pursue, that like we are actually pursuing things that are in the public interest, and that we're talking about them in ways that cannot be easily appropriated in these harmful ways. But I think there's only so much we can do like within ourselves. Like, you can write your paper as carefully as you want. If someone wants to appropriate it, they're going to, right? There's no magic set of words that you can say that is going to prevent, a grifter or an ideologue from perverting it in some way that suits their interests. So I think those are things that are worth doing, but I think there is something more we have to do. I don't know what that is, right? I don't think those recommendations are enough. Like I said, I think part of it is we do have to stick our necks out a little bit. We do have to, get in front of the public and, object to our research being used in ways that we do not endorse. Because I don't think there's any way of writing your paper that's going to prevent that from happening. At some point, you need to get up and say, like, no, I think that's wrong. Don't use my research this way.
Great. So let's end on that note then. And just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet? And I don't know, would you have any suggestions if people are interested in learning more about this specific topic on the manosphere and the misappropriation or the misuse of evolutionary psychology?
Yeah, I mean, you can find my work on my website, danconroybeam.com. We have all of our papers there if you're interested in reading the primary literature. You can also follow me on Blue Sky. Conroy-Beam is my handle on all socials. If you're interested in evolutionary psychology, I'd go straight to the source. Read up on the Center for Evolutionary Psychology website. There's a primer there that's like a great basic introduction to like the core principles of the field. And if you're interested in these sort of like intersections between evolutionary psychology and the manosphere, honestly, I could not recommend the person who got me into this, right? Louis Bachod, his work, I think, has been really eye-opening for me. I think is a great place to learn more. And, I gave a plug to FD Signifier before. I watched the rest of Ricardo's interviews as well, but I'd also check out FD Signifier. He's also like interviewed evolutionary psychologists before. I think he's a thoughtful guy who has really interesting perspectives on science and society and the manosphere. So I've enjoyed his content too.
Great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description of the interview and also to our first interview. So Dr. Conroy-Beam, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks so much for having me back. This is a great conversation.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.